Even if you're not using Linux yourself or you're not using a ton of open source products, your vendors are. In fact, we saw with Log4j a couple years ago that many vendors' products that you might not have even thought relied on open source software were relying on these libraries. And it's really a pervasive problem.
It is. And we've seen this. We actually have metrics behind this. I mean, malicious open source packages like the problems that we saw with XZ and other ones that are just simply poisoned or contain a vulnerability like Log4j are skyrocketing at this point. And it's because there's so much dependence on these open source software suites. As Sherry mentioned, you may not be using one, but the applications that you are using inside your network likely are. And that is how these things end up making it into our networks in the first place. Repositories like NPM or the NumPy package management system or PyPy, which works for the Python programming language, both highly heavily trafficked. And you can see how many new packages are being released per year by the year at this point. So Docker has become incredibly popular, especially for cloud-based systems for scalability purposes. We saw a massive increase in the number of packages that are coming out there. NPM is the same. Go is pretty similar. I mean, we're starting to see this really take over as a formal distribution method for a lot of software. And when we look at the number of data breaches over the last couple of years, we see a high attribution to third-party attack vectors, something like a piece of poisoned or compromised or vulnerable software. A lot of that comes down to the fact that they include pieces of open source software like this. So absolutely something that we will need to pay attention to. We also tend to see accidental disclosure of information from these software suites. And the two charts you see here, these are secret keys that are accidentally being leaked by these open source software suites. They're either made available for scanning or they are hard-coded into the software itself. Both of those are bad things. But we see Google, OpenAI are both heavily impacted by this. And having things like your Google instance compromised because a developer just made a slight mistake in a software suite could be pretty detrimental to your organization. We also see GitHub, where there's a lot of stolen source code anyway. We see Slack, we see AWS. I mean, all these are things that you want to keep secret. And so as we're utilizing things like connectors or like software applications that link in with our trusted applications, we want to make sure they're safe. It's taking a lot more vetting than it used to. It's why we need to know what these software suites actually are. And that's why we've talked about this for a while now, and hopefully this ends up gaining a little bit more traction as we go. But we really want to know what the ingredients of the software that we're using are. And we can get that using what's called a software bill of materials, or an SBOM. This will look for things like open source software, dependencies, packages, the development kits that are being used, the APIs that are being used, and it'll just give you basically the ingredients list to show what the software you're running is made from. And if something goes wrong, if there is actually a vulnerability identified, you can see if you are now vulnerable to that, which can be difficult in some cases. This also means we need to know when these vulnerabilities pop up. Sherry, do you want to take this one?
Sure. I mean, it's not enough just to know what you have. You also want to make sure you're monitoring so that if there's a threat, you can check and see if you're vulnerable. And this is especially important. We've seen in the past that attackers are going to try to make a move holidays, evenings, weekends. And so you really want to make sure you have 24/7 coverage, not just on whether there's threats in your network, but whether you have software products that may have critical vulnerabilities. I can tell you over and over, we've seen, the Kaseya attacks where there's a vulnerability in Kaseya and ransomware is launched, or similar attacks where they start on a Friday. MoveIt is another example. They start on a Friday or Thursday, and the hackers are exploiting thousands of systems all over the world. And if you're not monitoring the news, you may walk in Monday morning and poof, you've been hit with ransomware or you've already been exploited. And it doesn't matter if you patch after you've been exploited. We see this all the time. No worries, the patch has already been deployed. Well, if the hacker already has a backdoor, that's not going to help you. And I would assume if you have not patched and it's multiple days after a major vulnerability is announced, I assume that that system may be compromised, and check for threats. So anyway, how do you monitor for threat intelligence? Number one, you need to know what you have, identify your key software products and your providers. Look at your threat intelligence sources. That could be simple things like vendor alerts or social media. Sometimes that's the fastest and best way to find out information. There's also commercial platforms that you can use to get threat intelligence that relates to your particular software. Security vendors like CrowdStrike and Critical Stack will provide updates for those of you that may follow them. And then, of course, our national government, if you look at their website, will provide lots of extensive information, not just about vulnerabilities, but also about recommendations for remediation. And again, these will be a moving target. They typically change in the first hours and days after a new vulnerability is discovered. So the other thing to think about, of course, is we need to be doing third-party risk management. You are not going to be able to find a vendor that has no vulnerabilities and no issues. That's not a thing. But we want to be doing our best. Some key issues that have popped up are vendors that are lacking appropriate security controls or where there's a gap. And some cases that we've seen are the Sisense breach or the Okta breach, which has affected their customers. This could be because of an insider attack at the vendor. It could result in collection or theft of confidential customer information because your software vendors may collect sensitive information in order to provide you with their product. And then we sometimes also see a third party leverage to gain access to customers. Again, Kaseya is a great example of that. SolarWinds is another great example of that. Thank you so much, everyone. Again, this is Sherry Davidoff, CEO of LMG Security.
And I'm Matt Duran, Director of Training and Research for LMG Security. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out at any time. We would love to hear from you. You can reach us at info@lmgsecurity.com, find us on LinkedIn, or follow us on Twitter. Thanks again for joining, and we'll see you next time.